Imagine a country that could disappear within this century, not through war, not through revolution, not through political collapse, but simply because the ocean decides to swallow it whole. Imagine waking up every single morning knowing that the land beneath your feet, the land your grandparents were born on, the land where your children play and laugh and grow, could one day be gone. Submerged beneath rising tides, driven by forces mostly beyond your control, shaped by decisions made in faraway capitals and industrial corridors you will never visit. This is not a hypothetical scenario pulled from the pages of a science fiction novel. This is the very real and very urgent story of Kiribati, one of the most extraordinary, most vulnerable, and most overlooked nations on the face of the earth. It is a country that sits at the crossroads of history, geography, climate science, and geopolitics. And its fate is something that every single person living on this planet should care deeply about, because what is happening to Kiribati today is a warning, a flashing, urgent, and impossible to ignore warning about what could happen to countless other communities, cities, and coastlines across the world in the decades to come. So today, we are going to take a deep, thorough, and genuinely fascinating journey into the world of Kiribati, its remarkable geography, its ancient history, its colonial past, its hard-won independence, its vibrant culture, its struggling economy, and above all, its terrifying and deeply human confrontation with the crisis of climate change. By the time we are done, you will understand not only what Kiribati is, but why it matters, why its story is one of the most important stories being told anywhere in the world right now, and why the choices we make as a global civilization in the coming years will determine whether this incredible nation survives or disappears beneath the waves forever. Let us begin with geography, because to understand Kiribati, you first have to understand just how astonishing its physical existence is. Kiribati is located in the central Pacific Ocean, and it is, without question, one of the most geographically unusual nations that has ever existed anywhere on Earth. The country is made up of 33 coral islands and atolls, and these islands are not neatly clustered together in one convenient spot. Instead, they are scattered across an almost incomprehensibly vast stretch of ocean. An exclusive economic zone of roughly 3.5 million square kilometers. To put that into some kind of perspective, that is an ocean territory larger than the entire continent of India. And yet the total land area of all 33 islands combined amounts to only about 811 square kilometers. Think about that for a moment. Kiribati controls one of the largest ocean zones of any country in the world, and yet the actual land that its people can stand on, build on, and call home is smaller than many individual cities. The islands are divided into three main groups. The Gilbert Islands, which form the core of the country and are home to the vast majority of the population. The Phoenix Islands, which sit further out in the Central Pacific and include some of the most remote and pristine marine ecosystems on the planet. And the Line Islands, which stretch far to the east and include the famous island of Kiribati, better known to much of the world as Christmas Island. The capital of Kiribati is South Tarawa, located in the Gilbert Islands, and it serves as the political, economic, and cultural heart of the nation. Understanding the sheer geographic dispersal of these islands helps you immediately appreciate one of the core governing challenges of Kiribati. How do you build a unified national identity, deliver public services, enforce laws, and manage natural resources across 33 tiny islands spread across an oceanic territory larger than most continents? The answer, frankly, is that it is extraordinarily difficult, and it requires creativity, ingenuity, and an enormous amount of international support. One of the most mind-bending geographical facts about Kiribati is that it is the only country in the entire world that is located in all four hemispheres simultaneously: the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere. This is not just a quirky piece of trivia. It speaks to the extraordinary geographic spread of this nation, the way its islands dot the Pacific across an enormous range of latitudes and longitudes. And speaking of the meridians and lines that divide our globe, Kiribati has a particularly interesting relationship with the international dateline. In 1995, the government of Kiribati made the bold and deliberate decision to move the international dateline, shifting it dramatically to the east so that all of the country's islands would fall within the same calendar day. Before this change, the Line Islands and the Gilbert Islands were on opposite sides of the dateline, meaning that within the same nation, it could be Monday on one set of islands and Sunday on another, an absurdity that caused no end of practical complications for governance, commerce, and communication. After the adjustment, Kiribati became one of the first places on Earth to welcome each new day, and the island of Kiribati, with its position far to the east of the dateline's new location, became famous as one of the very first places on the planet to see the sunrise of each new year, a distinction that brought the island a brief but genuine moment of global attention as the year 2000 approached and the world prepared to mark the arrival of the new millennium. This kind of bold, creative use of geographic and temporal policy to shape national identity and international perception tells you something important about the character of Kiribati's leadership and its people. They are not passive actors waiting for the world to define them, but active agents working hard to shape their own story. The natural environment of Kiribati is both beautiful and brutally unforgiving. The islands are coral atolls, formed over millions of years as ancient volcanoes slowly sank beneath the surface of the ocean, and coral reefs grew up around them, eventually creating the low-lying ring-shaped islands we see today. The result is a landscape of extraordinary natural beauty. Turquoise lagoons, surrounded by rings of white sand and swaying coconut palms, coral reefs teeming with fish and marine life, an open ocean stretching to every horizon as far as the eye can see. The Phoenix Islands Protected Area, established in 2008 and expanded in the years since, is one of the largest marine protected areas in the world, encompassing an extraordinary diversity of marine life and representing a genuine and admirable commitment by Kiribati to conservation and environmental stewardship. But this beauty comes with a profound and existential vulnerability. The islands of Kiribati are incredibly flat and incredibly low. Most of the land sits only 1 to 2 meters above sea level, and in some places the islands are so narrow that you can stand in the middle and see the ocean on both sides of you at the same time. Freshwater is extremely limited because the islands have no rivers, no mountains to catch rainfall, and no significant underground aquifers. Only small, fragile freshwater lenses that float on top of the salt water below, easily contaminated and easily depleted. The ecosystems that sustain life here, the coral reefs, the lagoon fisheries, the coconut forests, the complex web of marine biology that makes these remote islands livable, are all delicate, all interconnected, and all increasingly under stress from both local pressures and the global forces of climate change. To understand the people of Kiribati and their deep connection to this challenging and beautiful environment, we need to go back a very long way, back more than 3,000 years, to the ancient Micronesian peoples who first settled these islands and built a civilization here from almost nothing. The original settlers of what we now call Kiribati were extraordinary seafarers, people who navigated the vast and featureless Pacific Ocean, using an intimate and sophisticated knowledge of stars, waves, winds, and ocean currents, without any of the navigational instruments that European sailors would rely on thousands of years later. They arrived, made these remote atolls their home, and over the centuries developed a rich and complex culture that was shaped at every level by the ocean that surrounded them. Their economy was built on fishing. The lagoons and reefs provided an abundant and reliable source of food. Coconut palms, which could grow in the sandy, salt-affected soil of the atolls where almost nothing else could survive, became the other great pillar of subsistence, providing food, water, oil, fiber, and building material, all in one remarkable tree. Ocean navigation was not just a practical skill, but a cultural art form, a body of knowledge passed down through generations and treated with enormous reverence. Community life was organized around extended family networks and village structures, with strong systems of mutual support, and shared responsibility that helped people survive in an environment that left little room for individualism or waste. This ancient and sophisticated civilization, built on the twin foundations of the sea and the coconut, sustained by deep knowledge, tight community bonds, and extraordinary adaptability, is the foundation on which everything that came later was built. And it remains very much alive in the values, practices, and identity of the Kiribati people today. The arrival of European explorers in the 18th century began a process of contact and change that would ultimately transform these islands profoundly. British and American explorers and whalers began visiting the Gilbert Islands in increasing numbers from the late 1700s onward, bringing with them new goods, new diseases, new religions, and new ideas about how the world worked. Christian missionaries followed, and over the course of the 19th century, Christianity, primarily in its Catholic and Protestant forms, became the dominant religion of the islands. A transformation that reshaped social norms, cultural practices, and community organization in ways that are still visible today. The balance of power on the islands shifted as some chiefs aligned themselves with foreign traders and missionaries, and the introduction of firearms accelerated conflicts that had previously been fought with traditional weapons. By the time the 19th century was drawing to a close, the stage was set for formal colonial intervention. In 1892, the British government declared the Gilbert Islands, along with the neighboring Ellis Islands, which today form the separate nation of Tuvalu, a British protectorate. And by 1916, the territory had been formally incorporated into the British Empire as the Gilbert and Ellis Islands Colony. Colonial rule brought significant changes to the islands. The British administration introduced formal systems of law and governance, built schools and medical facilities, and imposed new economic structures. The colonial economy was dominated above all by two activities: the production of copra, which is dried coconut meat from which coconut oil is extracted, and phosphate mining. The phosphate deposits on Banaba Island, also known as Ocean Island, were particularly significant. They were among the richest phosphate deposits in the Pacific. And their mining brought substantial revenue to the colonial administration, while causing enormous environmental destruction and deeply traumatic disruption to the Banaban people, whose island was essentially devastated by industrial extraction and who were forcibly relocated during World War II. A story of dispossession and suffering that still resonates deeply in the collective memory of the region. The colonial period was, in many ways, a time of profound injustice and exploitation, but it also brought lasting changes to language, education, and governance that would shape the post-independence nation in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. The legacies of colonialism in Kiribati, as in so many parts of the world, are neither simple nor easily summarized. They are layered, contradictory, and still being worked through in the present day. The Second World War brought the violence of global conflict directly to these remote Pacific islands in a way that left permanent scars on the landscape and in the memories of the people who lived through it. Japan occupied the Gilbert Islands in 1941, and for several years, the islanders found themselves caught between two imperial powers in a war that had nothing to do with them and that they had done nothing to invite. The most intense and consequential military engagement in the islands was the Battle of Tarawa, which took place in November 1943 and stands as one of the bloodiest battles in the history of the United States Marine Corps. American forces launched an amphibious assault on the Japanese-held island of Bedio in South Tarawa, and in just 76 hours of combat, more than 1,000 American Marines and sailors were killed and several thousand more were wounded. The Japanese garrison fought almost to the last man, with fewer than 20 surviving out of several thousand defenders. The sheer ferocity and cost of this battle shocked the American public and forced military planners to rethink their approach to amphibious warfare in the Pacific. The Battle of Tarawa is remembered today as a turning point in the Pacific Campaign, a brutal and costly lesson in the difficulty of assaulting heavily fortified island positions that shaped American military strategy for the rest of the war. For the people of Tarawa, the battle left their island physically devastated, with wreckage and unexploded ordnance that would take decades to clear, and memories of occupation and warfare that would linger in their oral history for generations. The rusted hulks of tanks and landing craft from that battle can still be found on and around Bedio today, silent and corroding monuments to one of the most intense periods of violence these islands have ever witnessed. After the war, the process of decolonization gradually gathered pace across the Pacific, as it did across much of the world. The Gilbert Islands moved toward self-governance, with internal autonomy increasing through the 1960s and 1970s. In 1975, the Ellis Islands separated from the Gilbert Islands colony and eventually became the independent nation of Tuvalu. Then, on July 12, 1979, the Gilbert Islands achieved full independence from the United Kingdom and became the sovereign nation of Kiribati. The name Kiribati, and this is a point that trips up almost everyone encountering it for the first time, is pronounced Kiribati because in the Gilbertese language, the sequence TI is pronounced like an S sound. The name is derived from Gilberts, the English name for the main island group. Adapted into the phonology and spelling conventions of the Gilbertese language, the independent nation adopted a constitution, established democratic institutions, and became a member of the Commonwealth of Nations and eventually of the United Nations. For the Kiribati people, the name for the citizens of Kiribati, independence was a moment of enormous pride and hope, a chance to determine their own future after nearly a century of colonial rule. The transition to independence was, by the standards of post-colonial transitions, relatively smooth. There was no violent conflict, no coup, no immediate political crisis, and the new nation set about building its institutions and defining its place in the world with a combination of optimism and pragmatism that has continued to characterize its approach to governance ever since. The population of Kiribati today stands at somewhere between 130,000 and 140,000 people, a figure that places it among the smaller nations of the Pacific by population. Though the geographic dispersal of that population across millions of square kilometers of ocean makes governance and service delivery uniquely challenging. The vast majority of the population are Kiribati, a Micronesian people with their own distinct language, the Gilbertese language, also known as Taitai Ni Kiribati, which belongs to the Austronesian language family and is related to other Micronesian languages spoken across the Central Pacific. English is also an official language and is used in government, education, and international communication. Christianity remains the dominant religion, with the Catholic Church and the Kiribati Protestant Church both having large followings, and religious life remains deeply woven into the social fabric of communities across the islands. Family and community networks are central to social organization, and the concept of the Utu, the extended family, continues to be the primary unit through which resources, support, and obligations are organized and distributed. The Ai Kiribati are a warm, resilient, and deeply communal people, and any visitor who has spent time in these islands will tell you that the sense of hospitality, generosity, and community solidarity that characterizes Ai Kiribati society is one of the most striking and moving things about the country. Nowhere are the challenges of life in Kiribati more visible than in South Tarawa, the capital, which packs a disproportionately large share of the national population into a very small and very fragile piece of land. South Tarawa is, by the standards of Pacific Island capitals, extraordinarily crowded. Population density in some parts of South Tarawa rivals that of major Asian megacities, an almost surreal situation, given that you are standing on a narrow coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This overcrowding has created serious and compounding problems. Waste management is a chronic challenge. Sanitation infrastructure struggles to keep pace with the population, and plastic waste, human waste, and other refuse create significant public health risks. Clean fresh water is scarce and increasingly contaminated. Housing is inadequate for the growing population. Yet people continue to move to South Tarawa from the outer islands, drawn by the promise of employment, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity that the capital, for all its problems, provides in ways the remote outer islands simply cannot. The strain on South Tarawa's limited resources and fragile environment is immense, and it is growing year by year. The paradox of Kiribati is that internal migration is concentrating population in the very place that is most exposed and most vulnerable to the effects of rising sea levels, even as the rest of the world debates what to do about the crisis driving that vulnerability. The economy of Kiribati is small, heavily aid-dependent, and faces structural challenges that are deeply difficult to overcome, given the country's remote location, limited natural resources, and small population. The most important economic sectors are fishing, the production of coconut products including copra, foreign aid, and remittances from Ai Kiribati workers living and working abroad. But of all these, it is the fishing industry, and specifically the management and licensing of fishing rights within Kiribati's enormous exclusive economic zone, that has the greatest potential to generate revenue and support sustainable development. The waters of the Central Pacific around Kiribati contain some of the most productive tuna fishing grounds in the entire world. Enormous stocks of skipjack tuna and other commercially valuable species migrate through these waters, and Kiribati's exclusive economic zone encompasses a vast portion of this resource. The government generates significant revenue by selling fishing licenses to foreign fishing fleets, primarily from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the United States, and China, allowing these vessels to operate within Kiribati's waters in exchange for substantial fees. This arrangement has made fishing license revenue one of the most important single sources of government income, and the careful management of these agreements is a matter of considerable diplomatic and economic importance for Kiribati. However, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing remains a serious problem. The sheer scale of Kiribati's ocean territory makes effective monitoring and enforcement extraordinarily difficult, and the losses from illegal fishing represent a significant drain on the country's most valuable natural resource. Beyond fishing, the Kiribati economy has limited options. Copra production continues, but international coconut oil prices are volatile, and the industry is not particularly lucrative. Tourism has potential. The remote, pristine beaches and exceptional marine environments of the outer islands and the Phoenix Islands have genuine appeal to a certain kind of traveler. But infrastructure limitations, the difficulty and cost of getting to Kiribati, and the lack of tourist facilities have kept visitor numbers low. The Revenue Equalization Reserve Fund, a sovereign wealth fund established in 1956 using revenues from the phosphate mining on Banaba Island, has provided a financial buffer for the government and continues to generate income from its investments, though its long-term management and the appropriate rate of drawing down its assets are subjects of ongoing policy debate. Remittances from Ai Kiribati workers overseas, particularly those employed as seafarers on international merchant ships, a profession in which Ai Kiribati have built a strong reputation, are an important source of income for families across the islands. And foreign aid, primarily from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the European Union, plays a crucial role in funding government services, infrastructure development, and climate adaptation projects. The economic situation of Kiribati is, in many ways, a reflection of the broader structural challenges facing small island developing states in the modern global economy. Remote, resource-constrained, highly vulnerable to external shocks, and dependent on international goodwill in ways that create genuine vulnerabilities to their sovereignty and self-determination. And now we come to the great crisis of our time as it relates to Kiribati, the existential threat posed by climate change and rising sea levels. To understand why Kiribati is so profoundly vulnerable to this threat, you need to hold in your mind that combination of facts we established at the beginning of this exploration. The islands are low, most of them sitting only 1 to 2 meters above sea level. They are coral atolls with no high ground, no hills to retreat to, no interior refuge from rising waters. their freshwater supply is limited and fragile. And their coastlines are directly exposed to the full force of the Pacific Ocean. Global average sea levels have been rising steadily as a result of climate change. Thermal expansion of the oceans as they warm and the melting of glaciers and ice sheets are both contributing to this rise. And the projections suggest that sea levels could rise by anywhere from several tens of centimeters to more than a meter by the end of the century, depending on how much greenhouse gas humanity continues to emit. For Kiribati, even a relatively modest rise in sea levels translates into a catastrophic and potentially civilization-ending threat. When the sea level rises by even a few tens of centimeters, islands that were already barely above the water become regularly inundated during high tides. When that water is salt water, it contaminates the freshwater lens that sits below the island, destroying the supply of drinking water. It kills the plants and the soil that allow food to be grown. It erodes coastlines and washes away the sand and coral that make up the island's structure. Some of Kiribati's islands are already experiencing what scientists call sunny day flooding, inundation during high tides, even in perfectly calm weather with no storm or wave surge required. Permanent land loss is already occurring on some islands, not as a future projection, but as a present and observable reality that the people living there experience in their daily lives. Beyond rising sea levels, climate change is intensifying other threats that compound Kiribati's vulnerability. Storm surges, already a serious danger in the Pacific, are becoming more severe as tropical weather patterns shift. Ocean acidification, caused by the absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide by the world's oceans, is degrading the coral reefs that protect Kiribati's coastlines from wave action and that underpin the marine ecosystems on which the population depends for food. Increasing ocean temperatures are causing coral bleaching events that kill reef systems that took centuries to build. Changes in rainfall patterns are affecting freshwater availability. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense. The cumulative effect of all these impacts on a country as small and as low-lying as Kiribati is not merely serious. It is, quite literally, existential. Scientists, climate advocates, and the people of Kiribati themselves have been saying this for decades, and yet the global response has remained woefully inadequate relative to the scale and urgency of the crisis. For the Kiribati, climate change is not a policy debate or a scientific abstraction. It is the water lapping at their doorsteps during high tide. It is the contaminated well that no longer provides clean water. It is the grave of an ancestor that has been washed into the sea. It is the lived, daily, unavoidable reality of their existence. The government of Kiribati has been grappling with these realities for decades, and the response has been a complex and sometimes agonizing combination of adaptation, advocacy, and contingency planning. On the adaptation side, Kiribati has invested in seawalls and coastal protection infrastructure, though the cost of building and maintaining effective coastal defenses on 33 islands scattered across millions of square kilometers of ocean is staggering relative to the country's financial resources. Land reclamation projects have been undertaken in South Tarawa, creating new land from the lagoon to accommodate the growing population. Water catchment systems and desalination technology have been explored as ways to address the freshwater challenge. Mangrove restoration projects have been implemented to provide natural coastal protection. Educational programs teach communities about adapting their agricultural and fishing practices to changing conditions. On the advocacy side, Kiribati has been one of the most vocal and persistent voices in international climate negotiations, consistently pushing for more ambitious commitments from the world's major greenhouse gas emitters, particularly the United States, China, the European Union, and other large economies whose emissions are driving the crisis that threatens Kiribati's very existence. Kiribati leaders have stood before the United Nations and the global media and demanded that the world wake up to the human cost of climate inaction, and their moral authority on this issue is undeniable. But it is perhaps on the contingency planning front that Kiribati's situation has attracted the most global attention and the most anguished debate. Former President Anote Tong, who led Kiribati from 2003 to 2016, was one of the most prominent and passionate advocates for climate action on the world stage, and during his presidency, he made a decision that seemed almost unthinkable. He began exploring the possibility of relocating the entire population of Kiribati to another country if the islands became uninhabitable. In 2014, the government of Kiribati purchased approximately 20 square kilometers of land on the Fijian island of Vanuatu at a cost of around $8 million as a potential site for future settlement. The purchase was described by President Tong not as an admission of defeat, but as a form of insurance, a hedge against the worst-case scenario in which rising seas made continued habitation of the current islands impossible. The move was simultaneously an act of pragmatic statesmanship and a profoundly sorrowful acknowledgement of the possibility that Kiribati, as a physical place, might not survive. It raised questions that philosophers, lawyers, and climate scientists are still wrestling with today. What happens to a nation when its land disappears? Can a country continue to exist as a legal and political entity, even if its territory is gone? What are the rights of climate refugees? And who bears the moral and financial responsibility for their displacement? These are not abstract questions. They are urgent, practical, human questions, and Kiribati is forcing the world to begin answering them. The idea of migration with dignity, the principle that if migration becomes necessary, it should happen on Kiribati terms, gradually, voluntarily, and with full respect for the rights and humanity of those who move, has become a central element of Kiribati's approach to this crisis, and it represents a genuinely novel and morally serious framework for thinking about climate displacement. Kiribati's geopolitical situation adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated story. Despite its tiny size and population, Kiribati occupies a position of genuine strategic importance in the Pacific, a region that has become an increasingly active arena of great power competition in recent years, as the United States, China, and Australia vie for influence among the Pacific Island nations. Kiribati's enormous exclusive economic zone, its strategic location across key Pacific shipping and communication routes, and its control over valuable fishing grounds all make it a nation of interest to much larger powers, even if it rarely appears in the headlines of major international newspapers. China and Kiribati re-established diplomatic relations in 2019. Kiribati had previously recognized Taiwan, a move that generated significant concern in Washington, Canberra, and Wellington. Reports emerged of Chinese interest in developing infrastructure on Kiribati's islands, including potentially on Canton Island in the Phoenix Group, which sits astride key Pacific sea lanes and was historically used as a strategic base during World War II. Whether or not these reports accurately reflected Chinese intentions, they were taken seriously by strategic analysts in the United States and Australia, who see Chinese presence in the Central Pacific as a significant shift in the regional security landscape. Australia and New Zealand, which have historically been the primary foreign aid donors and diplomatic partners of the Pacific Island nations, have been working to deepen their engagement with countries like Kiribati, partly out of genuine concern for the well-being of the island nations, and partly out of a desire to maintain their own strategic influence in a region they consider their sphere of responsibility. The United States, which fought some of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War in these islands and has long-standing strategic interests in the Pacific, has been increasing its diplomatic and development engagement with the region. For Kiribati, this geopolitical attention is both an opportunity and a risk. An opportunity to leverage outside interest into concrete support for climate adaptation and sustainable development, and a risk of being caught up in great power dynamics that could undermine the country's ability to chart its own course. Culture and identity remain powerful and living forces in Kiribati, even as the external pressures on the country grow more intense with each passing year. The Kiribati people have a rich cultural heritage that is expressed through music, dance, storytelling, handicrafts, and above all through their relationship with the ocean. Traditional canoe navigation, the art of reading the stars, the waves, and the wind to find your way across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, remains a source of immense cultural pride, even as modern navigation technology has made the practical need for these skills less acute. Traditional dancing, known as Dabino, is a central feature of community celebrations, ceremonies, and festivals, and the elaborate costumes, rhythmic movements, and communal participation involved in these dances speak to a culture that values collective expression, shared joy, and the continuity of ancestral tradition. The construction of traditional Maniaba, the community meeting house that serves as the center of village social and political life, continues to be an important cultural practice. And the Maniaba remains the space where communities gather to make decisions, celebrate important events, resolve disputes, and maintain the social bonds that hold the community together. Family and community are not abstract values in Kiribati. They are the lived reality of daily life, the networks of obligation and mutual support that allow people to survive and thrive in a challenging environment. The concept of Te Kate ni Kiribati, the Kiribati way, the customs and values that define Kiribati identity, is something that people speak about with genuine pride and genuine affection, even as the forces of globalization, climate change, and potential migration threaten to make it harder to sustain in the generations ahead. Looking toward the future, the story of Kiribati branches into several possible narratives, and which of these narratives comes to pass will depend in large measure on choices made not only by the Kiribati people themselves, but by the global community that surrounds them. In the most hopeful scenario, the world's major economies finally summon the political will to dramatically reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, slowing the pace of climate change and giving Kiribati and the dozens of other low-lying nations and coastal communities around the world facing similar threats a genuine chance to adapt, survive, and continue to thrive. In this scenario, international climate finance flows to Kiribati in meaningful quantities, funding seawalls, desalination plants, land reclamation projects, and the other infrastructure investments that could make continued habitation viable for generations to come. International law evolves to protect the rights and sovereignty of nations even as their physical territory is threatened by rising seas. And the Kiribati people are able to remain on the islands of their ancestors, maintaining their culture, their identity, and their connection to the ocean that has shaped every aspect of their existence for more than 3,000 years. In a more troubling but still manageable scenario, climate change continues largely unchecked, but the international community provides sufficient support for gradual, dignified migration, a process in which Kiribati people have genuine choices about where and how they relocate. The communities that receive them are prepared and welcoming, and cultural continuity is maintained through strong community networks and institutional support, even in a diaspora context. In this scenario, the nation of Kiribati might physically transform dramatically or even disappear beneath the waves, but the Kiribati people and their culture survive and adapt, preserving what is most essential about who they are even as the geography that gave birth to their civilization is changed forever. And in the darkest scenario, the world fails to act on climate change, fails to provide adequate support for adaptation or migration, and the Kiribati people face displacement without dignity, scattered across Pacific nations that are unprepared to receive them and unequipped to support their cultural continuity, their economic well-being, or their sense of identity and belonging. This is the scenario that the most urgent voices in Kiribati are working hardest to prevent, and it is the scenario that gives the most powerful moral weight to their demands for climate justice on the world stage. Kiribati may look, from the outside, like a small and distant collection of islands with little apparent relevance to the great questions of our time. But this perception, if you have followed this entire journey through its history, geography, culture, and crisis, should now seem obviously and completely mistaken. Kiribati stands at the intersection of some of the most important forces shaping the 21st century: climate change, great power competition, questions of sovereignty and international law, the rights of indigenous peoples, the sustainability of small island states in an era of globalization, the moral obligations of wealthier nations toward those who suffer most from crises they did least to create. What happens to Kiribati is not a footnote to the story of our time. It is, in many ways, one of the central chapters of that story, written in saltwater and coral and human lives. The choices that the world makes about greenhouse gas emissions, about climate finance, about the rights of climate refugees, and the obligations of wealthier nations toward those most vulnerable to the crises they have largely caused. These choices will be written most vividly and most painfully in the lives of the Kiribati people. They are watching, they are waiting, they are speaking loudly and with extraordinary dignity and moral clarity from the front line of a crisis that the rest of the world has the luxury of experiencing as a future threat, but that they are living as a present and urgent reality. Understanding Kiribati, learning its history, hearing its people's voices, and grasping the full weight of the crisis it faces. This is not merely an exercise in geographic curiosity or academic interest. It is a moral responsibility for every person who shares this planet and who has the power, however small, to influence the decisions that will determine whether this remarkable nation and its extraordinary people survive the century that lies ahead. The ocean is rising. The question is not whether Kiribati will have to fight for its survival. It already is. The question is whether the rest of the world will finally choose to stand beside it.